There is a name that, by the year 1900, appeared on instruction manuals printed in more than 50 languages on nearly every inhabited continent on Earth. That name is Singer. Sewing machines, obviously, but also, for a while, an entire way of buying things on credit, an entire way of settling patent disputes, and one of the tallest buildings human beings had ever constructed. And here's the detail almost nobody knows about it. The man whose name it is didn't actually win the lawsuit over the machine that made him famous. This is the story of a company built on borrowed rights that became one of the very first true American multinational corporations, and then quietly, deliberately, walked away from the exact product responsible for all of it. It starts in 1850, in a repair shop in Boston. Isaac Singer, an inventor, sometime actor, and by most accounts a genuinely restless man, had been hired to fix a faulty sewing machine. Instead of simply repairing it, he looked at the whole design and decided he could do better. He'd spent years bouncing between careers before that moment: mechanic, actor, inventor of things nobody particularly wanted. This was the first idea that actually stuck. In 11 days, working from scratch, he redesigned it completely. A straight vertical needle, an overhanging arm, a continuous stitch that didn't stop and start with every motion. He filed for a patent in August of 1851. Lacking the money to actually build a business around it, he partnered with a New York lawyer named Edward Clark, and I.M. Singer and Company was born. There was just one problem, a significant one. Another inventor, Elias Howe, already held an earlier patent covering the fundamental lock-stitch mechanism Singer's machine depended on.
In 1854, Howe sued Singer for infringement, and Howe won. The man whose name would eventually be stamped onto tens of millions of machines in dozens of languages around the entire world didn't actually hold the rights to make the thing his company was famous for. A court told him so directly and ordered him to pay Howe a royalty on every single machine sold from that point forward. Most companies would treat a loss like that as a fatal wound. Singer treated it as a business expense. By 1856, the sewing machine industry was drowning in lawsuits just like that one. Multiple inventors, overlapping patents, years of expensive litigation between rival manufacturers who all technically owed each other money. Singer, Howe, and the other major patent holders did something nobody in American industry had really done before. Instead of continuing to sue each other into the ground, they pooled their patents together into a single shared license called the sewing machine combination. Historians consider it the first patent pool in American history, a legal invention every bit as important in its own way as anything mechanical Singer himself had designed. That same year, Singer's business partner Edward Clark introduced something else that would prove just as consequential: selling machines on installment payments. For the first time, ordinary families who could never afford the full price up front could pay a little at a time and bring one home anyway. It's hard to overstate how strange that idea was at the time. Buying something expensive on credit, a little every month, is so ordinary today that it barely registers as an invention at all. In the 1850s, it was radical enough to change who could actually afford to own a Singer in the first place.
Between the patent pool and the payment plan, Singer had solved both of the problems standing between his invention and every kitchen table in America. Isaac Singer's business life was, by most measures, a genuine triumph. His personal life was considerably messier. Singer maintained a legal wife, a decades-long common law relationship, and other romantic relationships, more or less simultaneously, for years. Around 1860, a public incident exposed the full tangle of it, forcing him to leave New York in the middle of a genuine scandal. By most accounts, across his various relationships, he fathered as many as 26 children. It's worth pausing on that only long enough to say this: the company kept growing anyway. Business and reputation, it turns out, don't always travel together. Singer's manufacturing footprint grew right alongside its global sales. In 1867, the company opened its first factory outside the United States, near Glasgow, Scotland, one of the earliest genuine multinational manufacturing operations any American company had ever attempted. In 1873, a purpose-built factory opened at Elizabethport, New Jersey. At the time, it was described as the largest factory in the world devoted to manufacturing a single product. Isaac Singer himself never got to see most of this. He died in England in 1875,
still wealthy despite the scandal years earlier, leaving Edward Clark to run the company he'd helped build. Clark and the leadership that followed him kept expanding. In the early 1880s, Singer built an even larger factory at Kilbowie, near Clydebank, Scotland. Within a few decades, it would eclipse even Elizabethport, eventually employing more than 14,000 workers at its peak. 2 flagship factories, 2 continents, 1 product. Picture what that actually meant on the ground. 2 entire company towns, an ocean apart, both built almost entirely around the same machine, both employing thousands of families who had no idea their fates were tied together across the Atlantic. By 1900, cumulative sales had passed 20 million machines. Instruction manuals were printed in more than 50 languages. This wasn't just a successful American manufacturer anymore. It was arguably the first American consumer brand that was genuinely, completely global. In 1908, the company built a skyscraper in Lower Manhattan to match that ambition, the Singer Building. For a brief moment, at 612 feet, it was the tallest building on Earth. Think about what that says about a sewing machine company's sense of itself in 1908. Not content with dominating a global consumer market, it wanted the skyline too, even if only for a little while before someone taller came along. Even war didn't slow the company down for long. During World War I, the Elizabethport plant converted part of its production toward the war effort, manufacturing 75mm cannons and .45 caliber pistols alongside its usual sewing machines. And in 1933, in the middle of the Great Depression, Singer introduced one of its most beloved designs ever, the featherweight. Small, light, portable, and reliable enough that collectors and quilters still hunt for original models today, nearly a century later. For most of the 20th century, this company simply didn't seem to have a ceiling. Then, starting in the late 1950s, something started to shift, quietly at first. In 1958, facing rising costs, Singer moved about 40% of its main American production over to the Clydebank plant in Scotland, chasing lower expenses.
A few years later, Clydebank went through an expensive modernization, switching from heavy cast iron machines to lighter aluminum ones. Even the plant's famous clock tower, a genuine landmark, came down in 1963 as part of the changes. That same year, the company renamed itself, simply the Singer Company. It sounds like a small change. It wasn't. Because starting in the 1960s, Singer began pouring serious money into something that had nothing to do with sewing at all. Aerospace, defense electronics, flight simulators, electronic warfare equipment, missile guidance and navigation systems. Think about the distance between those two businesses for a second. Guiding a needle through fabric and guiding a missile toward a target. Almost nothing about the engineering, the customers, or the culture of those two businesses overlaps at all. By the late 1970s, that aerospace division wasn't a side project anymore. It was generating something like 53% of the company's entire revenue and 52% of its profit. More than half of everything Singer earned, by then, had nothing to do with the product that gave the company its name.
Workers there had watched the warning signs coming for years. The modernization, the shrinking workforce, the clock tower coming down in 1963 like an early omen nobody wanted to name out loud. Elizabethport followed less than 2 years later. The closure was announced in February of 1982. On December 1st of that same year, the plant produced its very last sewing machine, ending a 110 straight years of production at the site that had once been, quite literally, the largest single-product factory on the planet. A New York Times headline at the time put it about as plainly as anyone could: Singer plant closing, a way of life ends. But the company wasn't actually finished making decisions. In 1986, Singer did something almost no company on this channel has ever done. It didn't just close plants, it spun off the entire sewing machine business, every factory, every retail store, the Singer name itself, into a completely separate company owned by its own shareholders. The parent corporation kept only the aerospace and defense electronics division, the part of the business that, decades earlier, hadn't even existed. The company's chairman, Joseph Flavin, was surprisingly candid about it. It was an emotional decision, he said. You just don't walk away from a 135-year-old tradition without being touched. They walked away from it anyway. What happened to each half afterward tells you almost everything you need to know. Split a company in two, and you can watch, almost like a controlled experiment, what each half was actually worth to the people running it.
The aerospace-focused parent company, still legally called Singer, eventually fell under the control of a corporate raider named Paul Bilzerian in the late 1980s, who treated what remained of the conglomerate the way corporate raiders of that era generally did. The separately spun-off sewing machine company, meanwhile, still carrying the Singer name under license, struggled through the 1990s until a Hong Kong businessman named James Ting bought a controlling stake. For a few years under his ownership, Singer genuinely recovered, climbing back to roughly 40% of the entire global sewing machine market by 1998. It didn't last. In 1999, that same sewing machine company filed for bankruptcy. The name Singer, remarkably, is still around today. It's owned now by a private holding company alongside a couple of other sewing machine brands, based near Nashville, Tennessee, with manufacturing based overseas. None of it has any real connection anymore to Elizabethport or Clydebank, or the immigrant families who once built entire neighborhoods around those two factories. There's something almost too fitting about how this story started and how it ends. Isaac Singer built an empire on a machine he didn't technically hold the rights to, using a legal trick nobody in American industry had really tried before. 135 years later, his own company's leadership used an equally clever legal trick, a corporate spin-off, to hand that same machine to somebody else entirely and walk towards something that paid better. Clever, in this story, cuts in both directions. Somewhere right now, in a household you'll never visit, in a language you may never have heard spoken, someone is threading a needle on a machine that still carries this name.
The name is still stitched into machines being sold somewhere in the world right now, in more languages than most companies ever learn to speak. The company that actually built that name into something worth having, though, made its choice back in 1986, and it chose something else.